I didn't think I'd start this channel with a Halloween special, but what can I say? This game kinda crept up on me. It's appropriate as well, since I'll be following this with a review of the original Metroid quadrilogy. The Mummy Demastered is a game created as a movie tie-in for Universal's crappy Mummy 2017 film that I didn't see. But the game caught my eye because A, it's way forward and I can generally trust them to produce good games, especially film tie-ins, as they've also created arguably the best Aliens game, Alien Infestation on DS, not to be confused with Alien Isolation. And B, it's a Metroidvania, or Contravania style game that somehow manages to capture the aesthetics of both Metroid and Castlevania perfectly while maintaining its own visual identity, with gorgeous sprite animation all around. The basic premise for the game is you've got to deal with a naughty mummy that's going around London making a mess of things, and you and your various shambling former husks are the only ones who can stop it. There's not much more to the plot, and there doesn't really need to be. Unfortunately, rather than keeping it this simple, the game has a lot of story fluff that feels wholly unnecessary and only serves to interfere with the game flow, going so far as to prevent progress entirely until certain objectives are cleared, at least in the first area of the game, and for boss encounters repeating the unskippable dialogue with each new attempt, which is a minor inconvenience, but depending on how many attempts you take at a boss, it can easily change from minor annoyance to festering irritation. And this decision with the story did kinda get in the way of my initial good impression of the game. I think what bothers me most about it is how it does this while simultaneously poking fun at games like Other M and Metroid Fusion, which just comes across as hypocritical. It's not something that normally bother me too much, but the story doesn't really grab you the same way Fusion does. There's nothing so much as a twist, it just seems like stuff happens and you're told to shamble over to somewhere else and deal with it. The story didn't need to be anything special, but considering how in your face it ended up being, I can't help but hold it against the game. This form of storytelling is particularly egregious in the Metroidvania genre. If you're gonna drop me in a world and give me a grand objective, it only serves to inconvenience me, the player, and my desire to explore your world. I touched on it earlier, but the game literally halts your progress until you go to 3 objectives at the beginning of the game. I don't want to harp on the designers too hard, but if you want me to come across certain things before progressing, then either structure the world in such a way that I naturally come across them as I progress, or wall off certain areas with walls or doors that can only be opened by finding the items you want me to find. The last thing you want to do in an exploration-focused game like this is to tell the player how to explore it. I know you know this way forward, as the rest of the game beyond the beginning demonstrates that understanding. So why do you feel the need to make the game so invasive in the early game? That said, I think now's a good time to talk about the gameplay. As my brief summary of what drew me to this game might imply, it's a Metroidvania game, or Contravania according to a few Contra-loving friends of mine. I haven't played Contra myself, so take that as you will. You'll spend the game exploring various environments while uncovering new equipment that allows you to progress further, which is the basic principle of Metroidvania design philosophy. You get access to the basic infinite ammo automatic rifle, 2 limited ammo sub-weapons, and a slot for explosives, all of which can be changed out with other equipment you possess at weapon caches. The basic rifle cannot be upgraded, and the sub-weapons aren't used for exploration. But they do create an interesting combat dynamic which can cater to player preference, with each weapon having a distinct feel. Explosives, needless to say, are this game's take on Metroid's missiles, being used for both combat and progression. There are 3 types of explosives: grenades, incendiary grenades, and C4. I wasn't planning on bringing this up, but it's related to an issue I have with how the game handles progression. For the most part, all explosives share the same functionality of being able to bust open wooden paneling. However, C4 has a unique capability of breaking open iron gates, which are otherwise inaccessible. The game doesn't tell you about this distinction, and having left what explosive you use to player agency, if you prefer a different type of explosive after testing out the C4 and decide it's not for you, you're kinda left hanging when you encounter an iron door and wonder how you're supposed to progress. For all the good having this option did, they may as well have just made it a straight-up upgrade rather than leaving explosives to player discretion. In regards to upgrades that aren't related to the player's arsenal, they're largely harmless. About half of them aren't even mandatory, but those are largely mundane. Things like jumping higher, running faster, sinking? Sinking. This is more nitpicky than anything, but I personally find the mundanity kind of absurd considering you get these abilities from ancient magical artifacts. You gave us at least one ability with some creativity, albeit it's basically a rip-off of Metroid's Shine Spark, but still! Additionally, there are a few technical abilities that you can pull off, but they're rarely used, necessary, and they go completely unexplained. The aforementioned Shine Spark gets more destructive boost if you run for a fair bit before using it, surprise surprise. But the acceleration is a bit too slow to make it useful, and it's only required in one location to obtain an optional item. This may be the result of world design being relatively small compared to other Metroidvania-type games. The world largely consists of fairly linear horizontal structures, rarely more than 3 layers deep per area, used primarily as combat corridors, most likely due to its Contra influence, I assume. Apart from its size, I'd say the overall world design is pretty good considering the existing mechanics. The one thing I do gotta give the game high praise for is that, for upgrades and equipment, they're usually given their own rooms rather than being hidden in the Metroid fashion of sticking them in miscellaneous wall textures. The only drawback is that it gets rid of the puzzle element of discovery that you'd normally find in the Metroid games. To be clear, I'm not knocking Metroid for that too much, but I'll talk about that more at length at a later point. In fact, that leads into another problem I have with this game's collectible items. There are these items called relics, of which there are 50. Unlike artifacts and weapons, they serve no purpose, even after collecting them all, and you won't know this until you do it, and they're hidden within breakable background textures. Unlike Metroid, this game doesn't mark the map where items could be or have been obtained. This leads to a particularly tedious collectathon since there's no real way to track where you have and haven't obtained these. This would already be bad in light of other games that have done it better, had they actually given you something to help you collect them all, but they don't. They only exist as a time sink, and for achievement hunting. Granted, the game isn't so long that it gets in the way of the experience. Heck, I still managed to beat the game in 4 hours, but I can't recommend doing it. One interesting thing that caught my attention, for better and for worse, was what I'll call adaptive enemy design. Rather than basing enemies that appear throughout the game on progression and location, though those are certainly a part of it, the game will scale enemy damage, movesets, mobility, and in some areas quantity, in relation to the number of upgrades, artifacts, and equipment you've found. As a result, I feel like some areas tend to become oversaturated in enemies and the further you get into the game, making it difficult to avoid damage. It never feels unfair, mind you, but it can be a bit annoying if you just want to explore in search of certain items. Now, the biggest point of contention for me with the gameplay design is the seemingly benign mechanic shown in the initial trailer. When you die in this game, you drop all of your equipment, weapons, and artifacts, including health upgrades, and your corpse reanimates. And the only way to get it back is to return to the last place you died and kill your previous character. This is a cool idea conceptually, and it mostly works well during normal gameplay, but it's brought down by a few things that I think could make or break the game for some people. Some have reported dying in areas that are inaccessible without the equipment they've dropped, and what, for me, was the most irritating problem was how it doesn't refill your HP and ammo. Now, that might sound like a weird complaint. You might be thinking to yourself, what? You want the game to be easier? Can't you handle a little challenge? Get good, scrub! You straw man you, but hear me out. The problem with not having it refill your HP and ammo is that if you die in a boss fight, for example, thankfully your body doesn't spawn in the boss room, but without the full health refill, you're left in a scenario where you've got only a fraction of your total HP and ammo, and your only options are to either grind your HP and ammo back, or attempt the boss fight again at a severe disadvantage. With no health recovery stations, you're not left with much of a choice, and unlike, say, Dark Souls, most save rooms are stationed right outside of the boss rooms, so there's not even the opportunity to learn on your way back. Your only option is to screw yourself over or go back to a previous area and grind. And let me tell you, grinding for 15 to 20 minutes to regain your health each time you die in a boss fight isn't fun. It isn't challenging, it's tedious. And in a game about exploration, the last thing you want to do as a designer is bring the game flow to a screeching halt with a needlessly punishing mechanic. Way forward, if you're listening, I can offer a few suggestions. 1. Have HP and ammo get fully restored after a successful body recovery. Or 2. makes save stations double as HP recovery stations. As it stands now, for those interested, if you don't want to deal with the tedious repercussions of this mechanic, your best option is to simply quit out of the game just before dying. If you wait till your HP hits 0, the game will autosave, forcing you to perform the tedious health grind. Seriously, I can't emphasize enough how much of a pain this mechanic can be in the wrong circumstances. And I can understand if that turns some people away from the game. It's a damn good game, but that one flaw really holds it back. That said, I do want to talk about one last thing before I go that I really like, and that's the visuals and music design. As I mentioned at the start, the game manages to straddle the line between art styles of 2D Metroid games and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, while maintaining its own unique aesthetic. At times, the game does like to pay direct homage to these two games, but for the most part, it stands up on its own without becoming overly reliant on the groundwork laid by those previous games. I wouldn't exactly call this game's visuals unique, but they do enough to separate themselves from the games they drew direct inspiration from. What's particularly impressive to me is the background art, which combined with the game's sublime use of parallax scrolling really lends to the game's atmosphere. While I definitely gotta give the art team props, there is one thing I find somewhat disappointing, and that's the art design for the enemies. While the sprite work and animations on them is just as strong as the rest of the design aspects, there are unique enemies in some areas. I feel that each area of the game lacks a unique identity. You'll come across several enemy types across all of the areas in the games, and it could be budget or the scope of the project, but for whatever reason, the enemy design variety is lacking. While I think the attack pattern variety is fine, I think something as simple as a reskin of sorts could have resolved this. Though I understand the amount of effort that goes into animation all too well, so I can understand the need to cut corners for budgeting issues. As for the music, well, it's funky, enjoyable, and somehow manages to add the ambience to the environments you're exploring. While I found one track to be rather lackluster, I felt the majority of the game's soundtrack was excellent, and was just as much the star of the show as the game's visuals. Overall, if Metroidvanias are your thing, I think this is a really good game. While I find it difficult to recommend because of the aforementioned death mechanic, should that be patched at some point, I can definitely recommend checking it out. But as it stands now, it's up to you. It doesn't command a mastery of the genre as games like Hollow Knight, Metroid, and Castlevania do, but if you want a Metroidvania, then this is an enjoyable little game. Just, don't waste your time on the relics. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, please be sure to like and subscribe, and I hope you all have a great night.